that I think the initial image of him that was portrayed was misleading to an extent. And I think that in the chaos of trying to get the initial information about him out, that various things got taken and misconstrued. So I would just tell everyone that he's smart, he's capable, he's funny, he's able to speak to you and to recognize things. You know, he's a teenager, and jokes, the way he laughs when he tells a funny. He had, there's a video that I put out that he was being goofy, and he had this like half-gallon of green tea that he had gotten from the grocery store, and he thought of this joke, and he ran in the kitchen and he grabbed a green cup and he was like, "Mom, green tea!" And it was just so funny, and I was just like, "Dude, hold on, you gotta do that again." And I grabbed my phone and I was like,
What kind of mother speaks about her missing son in the past tense before he is found, before a body, before an arrest, before any proof that he is gone? In the case of Sebastian Rogers, the investigation does not begin in the woods or on surveillance footage. It begins with words, with sentences that quietly assume an ending that no one else has confirmed. While police searched for footprints and scent trails, a different signal emerged: linguistic, behavioral, and deeply unsettling. This is not a story about grief. It is a story about timing, control, and what someone may already believe to be true. In missing child investigations, there is a familiar progression. First comes the search. Then, only after evidence accumulates, comes the investigation. Terrain is covered. Dogs are deployed. Cameras are reviewed. The assumption, until disproven, is that the child may still be alive, moving, or reachable. That assumption anchors both law enforcement strategy and parental language. The disappearance of Sebastian Rogers did not follow that pattern. Sebastian Rogers, a 15-year-old boy with autism, was reported missing from his home in Tennessee during the night of February 25, 26, 2024. According to available public information, he was last seen at home. By morning, he was gone. What followed, however, was not a prolonged uncertainty marked by expanding search parameters. Instead, the case entered a different posture with unusual speed. From the outset, investigators faced an absence that was not merely troubling, but structurally anomalous. There was no scent trail extending away from the home. Canine units failed to establish directionality. There was no surveillance footage capturing Sebastian leaving the neighborhood. No forced entry was reported. No confirmed sightings followed. In walk-away cases involving adolescents, particularly those with neurodevelopmental conditions, some trace almost always appears: a footprint, a camera clip, a discarded item, a confirmed observation. Here, there was nothing. Within a relatively short period, authorities scaled back ground searches and publicly acknowledged a transition toward an investigative phase. This shift, while not unprecedented, is typically driven by new evidence, signs of abduction, recovered belongings, forensic indicators, or credible witness accounts. None of those were made public in this case. Instead, the transition occurred in a vacuum of external proof. That vacuum is the first signal of a frame shift. A frame shift occurs when the working theory of a case changes, not because new facts are introduced, but because existing facts fail to support the original assumption. In Sebastian's case, the assumption that he left on his own began to collapse under its own weight. The environment offered no confirmation. The timeline offered no clarity. And critically, the only coherent narrative available came from inside the home. This is where the case narrows, not by accusation, but by logic. When a disappearance leaves no external trace, investigative gravity pulls inward. The focus shifts from geography to testimony, from terrain to timelines, from movement to access. And in that inward turn, one individual inevitably becomes central, the last adult known to have been with the child. Katie Proudfoot, Sebastian's mother, occupies that position. This does not make her a suspect. It makes her a narrative gatekeeper. A narrative gatekeeper is not defined by intent or guilt, but by informational control. It is the person through whom the final known version of events must pass. In Sebastian's case, Katie is the source of the last confirmed interactions, the overnight context, and the morning discovery. The timeline between midnight and 6 a.m. The critical window in which Sebastian is believed to have vanished is constructed almost entirely through her account and that of the household. In cases that remain framed as searches, this role carries limited weight. In cases that shift toward investigation, it becomes foundational. What is striking in this case is not merely that the investigation pivoted, but how quickly public language began to reflect that pivot. Before law enforcement named suspects, before forensic conclusions, before any confirmation of Sebastian's fate, the framing changed from missing to something more final in tone. If not an official declaration, language matters in investigations, not because words convict, but because they reveal assumptions. In the early phase of a disappearance, most parents anchor their language in uncertainty. They say, "is missing. We are looking. We believe he will be found." This pattern persists even in long-term cases, sometimes for years, precisely because hope and ambiguity coexist. In Sebastian's case, observers noted something different. Not a single statement, but a pattern. A gradual but noticeable shift toward reflective, past-oriented language. Toward remembrance rather than immediacy. Toward meaning-making rather than urgency. These observations did not originate from law enforcement press releases, but from public interviews and commentary attributed to the person closest to the last known moment. This is where the frame shift becomes inseparable from Katie's role, not as an accused party, but as the axis around which interpretation began to rotate. Investigators are trained to ask a specific question when a case behaves abnormally. What is driving the deviation? Sometimes the answer is evidence. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is contradiction. And sometimes it is narrative. In the absence of external indicators, the internal story gains disproportionate influence. Decisions about scaling back searches, reallocating resources, and exploring foul play are not made lightly. When they occur without a triggering discovery, they are often the result of cumulative inconsistencies, unresolved gaps, or behavioral signals that suggest the initial frame no longer holds. This does not mean law enforcement concluded a crime occurred. It means the walk-away model failed. And when a model fails, attention returns to the source of the model itself. Katie's public language, her descriptions of Sebastian, and the structure of the narrative she presented did not exist in isolation. They interacted with the absence of physical evidence and the silence of the environment. Together, they created a condition where the original assumption voluntary departure could no longer be sustained. The question, then, is not whether Katie caused the shift. The question is whether her account, intentionally or not, accelerated it. This distinction matters. Investigative focus is not moral judgment. It is prioritization under uncertainty. When no footprints lead outward, investigators follow the words left behind. When no cameras record movement, they analyze timelines. And when only one person can describe the final hours, that person's language becomes part of the evidence landscape, not because it proves anything, but because it is all that remains. Sebastian's case did not change because something was found. It changed because nothing was. And in that nothingness, the story told by the last adult with him became the gravitational center of the investigation. The unresolved question that now frames this case is both simple and unsettling. Why did the disappearance of Sebastian Rogers move toward foul play consideration without external evidence, and whose words made that shift feel inevitable? That question does not accuse. It defines the problem investigators are now trying to solve. When a child disappears, investigators do not begin with suspicion. They begin with access. This distinction is critical because it separates emotional interpretation from investigative necessity. The hypothesis of caregiver exclusive access is not a theory of guilt. It is a framework used when all outward explanations collapse. And in the case of Sebastian Rogers, that collapse occurred early. The hypothesis can be stated plainly. If a child disappears without leaving the home, and without evidence of outside involvement, the last caregiver becomes the unavoidable investigative focus. Not because they are presumed responsible, but because they are the only known variable remaining. Sebastian Rogers was last confirmed to be inside his home on the night of February 25, 2024. That confirmation originates from family statements. By the morning of February 26, he was gone. Between those 2 points lies the most important span of time in the case, a window commonly cited as approximately 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. That timeline does not come from surveillance footage. It does not come from a neighbor. It does not come from a digital record or a physical trace. It comes from within the household itself. This matters. In investigations, timelines derived solely from interested parties are not treated as facts. They are treated as claims. Claims require corroboration. And in Sebastian's case, corroboration is notably absent. There is no independent witness who can confirm Sebastian was alive after bedtime. No text message, no camera capture, no sound recorded by a device, no physical movement detected. The last verified status of Sebastian alive in the home rests on the account of those who lived with him. Among them, Katie Proudfoot holds a unique position. Katie is the last person to publicly confirm Sebastian's presence. She is the source of the overnight context. She is the person who reports discovering his absence in the morning. This does not place blame. It places responsibility for narrative accuracy. In cases where a child leaves the home voluntarily, evidence almost always appears. A door sensor triggers. A camera records motion. A scent trail extends outward. Even when children intend to disappear, they interact with the environment. They leave traces. Investigators rely on those traces to build outward. Here, there was no outward trail to follow. No scent trail was established beyond the home. Canine units could not determine a direction of travel. No surveillance footage showed Sebastian leaving the property or moving through the neighborhood. There was no forced entry suggesting an intruder. There was no sign of a struggle outside, no dropped items, no confirmed sightings. The environment was silent. When investigators encounter silence, they do not assume innocence or guilt. They assume containment, that whatever happened occurred within a limited space or limited set of actors. This is where caregiver exclusive access becomes relevant. A vulnerable autistic teenager does not typically vanish without interacting with the world. Such individuals are statistically less likely to navigate unfamiliar environments undetected, especially at night, without tools, preparation, or assistance. That does not make disappearance impossible, but it raises the threshold of explanation. To accept that Sebastian left the home on his own, investigators would need to explain how he did so without triggering cameras, without leaving scent, without being seen, and without leaving behind any physical indication of departure. Each missing element compounds the improbability. Together, they force the investigation inward. This is not a moral judgment. It is a process of elimination. The caregiver exclusive access hypothesis emerges when all alternative access routes fail. If no one entered the home, and if the child did not leave the home in any detectable way, then the only remaining access points are the individuals already inside. This is why last caregiver is not an accusation. It is a starting point. Law enforcement manuals and child disappearance protocols consistently emphasize this principle. When environmental evidence does not support a walk-away or abduction, investigators re-examine the household. They scrutinize timelines. They test consistency. They compare statements over time. They look for gaps not to assign blame, but to identify where certainty ends. In Sebastian's case, the gap is the night itself. The timeline between midnight and morning is constructed almost entirely from family recollection. There is no external timestamp confirming when Sebastian was last seen awake. No device log confirming movement. No independent verification that the reported window accurately captures the moment of disappearance. This creates a paradox. The most critical period of the case is also the least observable. Under such conditions, investigators narrow the field not by suspicion, but by necessity. They focus on those who had exclusive access to the child during the unobservable window. This does not mean others are excluded permanently. It means resources are prioritized where answers are most likely to be found. Katie cannot be peripheral to that process. Not because she is accused, but because she is central to the only available narrative. Her account defines the boundaries of the investigation. Her descriptions establish the timeline. Her words frame the context in which Sebastian is believed to have disappeared. This is why investigators return to caregivers repeatedly in cases like this. Not to pressure, but to verify. Not to accuse, but to reconcile. Each retelling is examined for stability. Each detail is tested against what is known and what remains unknown. The absence of corroboration does not imply deception, but it does demand scrutiny. There is also a critical asymmetry in how evidence functions here. Physical evidence can be disproven. A camera clip can be reinterpreted. A scent trail can be extended. But a narrative without external anchors becomes increasingly difficult to validate over time. As memories fade and stress reshapes recollection, the opportunity for clarity diminishes. That is why the caregiver exclusive access hypothesis carries investigative weight early. It is not about fault. It is about preservation of facts, of timelines, of accuracy. In this case, the field does not narrow because investigators chose it to. It narrows because there is nowhere else to go. The absence of an exit explanation is not neutral. It actively redirects attention. And when attention redirects inward, it must pass through the person who last spoke for the child. Katie's role as the last confirmer of Sebastian's presence places her at the center of this hypothesis by default. Any investigation that treats her as peripheral would be ignoring the basic mechanics of missing child analysis. The uncomfortable reality is that some cases demand this focus, even when no wrongdoing is proven. Investigators do not have the luxury of emotional avoidance. They follow access, not sympathy. The hypothesis remains just that, a hypothesis. It does not state what happened. It states where answers are most likely to be found. And it leaves the case with a single, unavoidable question, one that does not accuse, but cannot be ignored. If Sebastian did not leave the home, who had exclusive access to him during the critical window? That question defines the investigation that follows. In investigations involving vulnerable individuals, behavior is evaluated not in isolation, but in context. Actions are weighed against known risk factors. Responses are compared to expected patterns. When those patterns fail to align, the inconsistency itself becomes evidence not of guilt, but of uncertainty requiring explanation. This is the foundation of the behavioral incongruity hypothesis. It can be stated simply: when a caregiver's behavior does not align with the risks they themselves describe, that mismatch becomes a point of investigative interest. In Sebastian Rogers' case, this hypothesis centers on one detail that appears minor at first glance, but grows more significant under scrutiny: the reported sound during the night. Katie Proudfoot has repeatedly described Sebastian as sensitive to loud noises. This sensitivity is not presented as incidental. It is emphasized as part of his daily functioning. According to her statements, Sebastian struggled with auditory overstimulation. Loud or sudden sounds caused distress. He required accommodations. He reacted strongly to noise. This characterization establishes an important baseline. Then comes the thud. Katie reports hearing a loud noise during the night Sebastian disappeared. The sound is not dismissed as imagined. It is remembered clearly enough to be mentioned later. It occupies space in the narrative of that night. Yet, despite this, no action followed. No welfare check. No verbal confirmation. No entry into Sebastian's room. No attempt to determine the source. This is the incongruity. In households caring for neurodivergent children with known sensory sensitivities, loud unexplained sounds typically prompt immediate concern. The response does not need to be dramatic. It can be as simple as checking a room, calling a name, or ensuring safety. The precise action varies, but the instinct is consistent: noise plus vulnerability equals verification. That verification did not occur here. The key issue is not whether Katie should have known something was wrong. It is that she later remembered the sound as significant yet treated it as insignificant in the moment. This temporal disconnect is where behavioral analysis begins. Investigators distinguish between stress responses and behavioral omissions. A stress response is a reaction that occurs under pressure, fear, or confusion. It is immediate, even if imperfect. A behavioral omission, by contrast, is the absence of an expected action in a moment where awareness is present. The thud falls into the latter category. Katie's later recall indicates awareness. She did not forget the sound. She did not dismiss it as non-existent. She recalled it clearly enough to incorporate it into the explanation of events. But awareness without response raises a question. Why did the sound not trigger concern at the time it occurred? This matters because investigators place greater weight on actions taken in real time than on details recalled after the fact. Real-time behavior reflects instinct. Post-event memory reflects reconstruction. In forensic psychology and investigative interviewing, there is a well-documented distinction between events that prompt immediate action and events that gain significance only after an outcome is known. The latter are often reshaped by hindsight. Details are reinterpreted. Neutral occurrences are elevated. Meaning is assigned retroactively. This does not imply deception. It implies human cognition at work. However, when a retroactively significant detail aligns conveniently with the unexplained outcome, investigators must consider whether the detail represents an actual event or a narrative anchor introduced to bridge a gap. The thud serves a functional role in the story of Sebastian's disappearance. It introduces motion. It implies activity. It offers a potential moment of change. Yet it does so without generating any contemporaneous response or verification. That functional role is precisely what draws investigative attention. If the sound occurred and was alarming, the absence of action is difficult to reconcile with the caregiver's own portrayal of her child's needs. If the sound was not alarming, its later elevation into a key detail becomes questionable. Either scenario presents a contradiction. Behavioral incongruity is not about judging what someone should have done. It is about identifying moments where stated priorities and actual responses diverge. In this case, Katie's emphasis on Sebastian's sensory vulnerability is not matched by her reaction to a sudden, unexplained noise during the critical window. Investigators ask specific questions in such circumstances. Was the sound interpreted differently at the time? Was it attributed to something benign? Was attention diverted elsewhere? Or was the sound not perceived as noteworthy until after Sebastian was discovered missing? Each possibility carries different implications. If the sound was dismissed as benign, investigators would expect that explanation to appear in early accounts. If attention was diverted, they would seek to understand why. If the sound gained importance only later, they would examine when and how it entered the narrative. This is where the difference between acted-upon events and remembered later events becomes critical. Acted-upon events leave behavioral traces. Doors are opened. Lights are turned on. Conversations occur. Remembered later events leave only verbal traces. They exist solely in recounting, not in action. In Sebastian's case, the thud appears to belong to the second category. The investigative value of this hypothesis lies not in proving what the sound was, but in questioning how it functions within the story. Does it represent a real incident that failed to trigger response? Or does it represent an explanatory detail added after the disappearance was already known? Both possibilities warrant scrutiny. Behavioral incongruity does not establish wrongdoing. It establishes uncertainty. It signals that the narrative may contain elements shaped by hindsight rather than real-time perception. And in investigations where physical evidence is absent, narrative integrity becomes especially important. The hypothesis therefore raises two possibilities, neither of which can be dismissed without examination first. The thud may be a reconstructed memory, its significance inflated after the outcome, providing a perceived turning point where none was recognized at the time. Second, it may function as a narrative anchor, offering a moment that appears to explain the disappearance without generating verifiable actions or evidence. Neither explanation assigns intent. Both require careful evaluation. This is why behavioral incongruity is not about blame. It is about coherence. Investigators seek stories where actions, risks, and reactions align. When they do not, the misalignment itself becomes a data point. In a case already defined by absence, no scent, no surveillance, no exit, the integrity of the remaining narrative carries disproportionate weight. Every detail must be examined not only for what it claims, but for how it was treated in the moment it allegedly occurred. Which leads to the unresolved question at the center of this hypothesis. Was the sound an event that genuinely occurred or a detail created to explain a disappearance already known? The answer to that question may determine how investigators interpret everything that follows. In investigative analysis, Language is not treated as confession. It is treated as signal. Words do not prove events, but patterns of speech, especially under stress, can reveal how a speaker internally frames reality. This principle underlies the linguistic leakage hypothesis, which holds that language can reveal internal conclusions long before external confirmation exists. The hypothesis does not claim intent or guilt. It claims that cognition often outruns evidence, and that speech sometimes exposes that lead. In the case of Sebastian Rogers, the issue is not a single phrase or an isolated slip. It is a pattern. Public statements attributed to Katie Proudfoot repeatedly describe Sebastian using the past tense. The phrasing appears in multiple contexts and at different moments. Examples include constructions such as, he was, loved, he enjoyed. These are not inherently suspicious in isolation. People speak imperfectly, especially under pressure. However, the pattern extends beyond descriptive reminiscence. Additional phrases appear that carry memorial framing, in honor of Sebastian, or conditional language that presumes resolution, even when we do bring him home. Again, none of these statements independently establish meaning. Their investigative relevance arises from timing, repetition, and contrast. Timing matters because these statements occur while Sebastian remains missing, without confirmation of death, without recovery, and without official closure. Repetition matters because linguistic leakage is identified not by one error, but by consistency across contexts. Contrast matters because missing child cases provide a large comparative baseline for how parents typically speak when outcomes are unknown. That baseline is strikingly consistent. In unresolved disappearances, parents overwhelmingly anchor their language to the present tense. They say, is missing, not was. They say, we are searching, not we searched. This persists for years, even decades, precisely because the absence of certainty sustains psychological suspension. The present tense becomes a way of holding space for the unknown. This pattern has been documented across numerous cases, regardless of eventual outcome. Even when hope diminishes privately, public language often remains carefully present-oriented. Parents do this instinctively and strategically. It keeps the search active. It avoids premature closure. It resists finality. That is why deviations draw attention. The past tense does more than describe. It implies completion. It frames a subject as concluded rather than ongoing. When used repeatedly in a case without confirmation, it suggests that the speaker may have internally processed an ending that has not been externally validated. This is the core of the hypothesis. Linguistic leakage does not mean the speaker knows what happened. It means the speaker's internal model of the situation may be further along than the public facts justify. That internal model can be shaped by fear, resignation, belief, or assumption. The hypothesis does not assign which. Investigators therefore ask a narrow, disciplined question: why does the language reflect closure in the absence of closure? The answer is not singular, and responsible analysis must acknowledge alternatives. Fatigue is one explanation. Chronic stress degrades linguistic precision. People under emotional strain may default to past tense when recounting memories, especially when describing a child's personality or interests. Poor media coaching is another explanation. Without guidance, speakers may not consciously monitor tense, particularly when recounting anecdotes. Grief anticipation is also relevant. Some caregivers begin psychological mourning before facts are known as a coping mechanism. This can unconsciously alter language, shifting speech toward remembrance even while uncertainty persists. Each of these explanations is plausible. None can be dismissed outright. However, what keeps the hypothesis active is pattern density. Investigators are trained to differentiate between slips and structures. A slip is random. A structure is repeated. In this case, the past tense appears across different interviews, in different contexts, and alongside language that suggests commemoration rather than continuation. The phrase, in honor of Sebastian, is particularly instructive. Honor language is typically reserved for memorialization scholarships, foundations, tributes after outcomes are known. When such language appears before resolution, it introduces a conceptual shift. It frames the subject as legacy rather than presence. Similarly, conditional phrasing like, even when we do bring him home, operates rhetorically to soften finality, but it still presupposes a timeline in which the outcome has been mentally rehearsed. The structure suggests an internal narrative moving forward from an assumed end state. Again, this does not prove foreknowledge. It suggests premature psychological closure. From an investigative standpoint, premature closure matters because it can shape behavior. It influences urgency, decision-making, and priorities. If a caregiver internally believes an outcome is fixed regardless of evidence, actions may unconsciously align with that belief. Search behavior may diminish. Narrative control may increase. Future-oriented projects may replace immediate recovery efforts. This is why language is examined not as evidence of crime, but as evidence of cognition. Responsible analysis must also guard against overreach. Linguistic indicators are supportive, not determinative. They cannot stand alone. They must be weighed against corroboration, physical evidence, and consistency over time. Investigators do not arrest on verb tense. They contextualize it. Yet they do not ignore it either. The strength of linguistic analysis lies in aggregation. When past tense appears alongside behavioral incongruity, narrative control, and absence of physical evidence, it gains relevance. Not because it confirms wrongdoing, but because it may explain why the case evolved the way it did. In Sebastian's case, the evolution is the mystery. The shift from search to investigation occurred without external triggers. In such situations, investigators look inward toward statements, timelines, and psychological framing. Language becomes one of the few remaining artifacts. The integrity of this analysis depends on restraint. It acknowledges uncertainty. It resists attribution of motive. It allows for benign explanations while still recognizing that patterns, especially those repeated publicly, can influence how a case is perceived and pursued. Ultimately, the linguistic leakage hypothesis does not claim that words reveal truth. It claims that words reveal belief. And belief, accurate or not, shapes action. Which brings the analysis to its central question, one that does not accuse but cannot be dismissed. Why does Katie's language sound as if the outcome has already been processed, while the facts remain unresolved? That question does not conclude the investigation. It explains why investigators continue to listen. In investigations, what is said is important. What is not said can be just as revealing. When a child disappears, investigators routinely reconstruct the final night in granular detail. Bedtime routines, final conversations, emotional states, small deviations from habit. These details are not sought for sentimentality. They are sought because they anchor timelines and reveal points of disruption. The final hours before a disappearance often contain the only indicators of what went wrong. In the case of Sebastian Rogers, that night remains conspicuously undefined. Despite multiple public statements, interviews, and narratives, the final evening before Sebastian vanished has never been described with specificity. There is no detailed account of his bedtime routine, no clear description of the last interaction, no portrayal of his emotional or physical state. The night exists only as a boundary before and after without substance in between. This omission is not trivial. It is structural. In missing child investigations, caregivers are typically asked to recount the final night repeatedly. The repetition is intentional. Investigators look for consistency, variation, and detail density. Even under stress, most caregivers can describe routine actions with relative clarity. What time the child went to bed, whether anything seemed off, what was said, what the mood was like. These details are usually offered spontaneously, without prompting, because they are the last normal moments before the abnormal occurs. In Sebastian's case, those moments are absent from the public record. There is no description of how Sebastian typically prepared for sleep. No mention of whether he followed a consistent routine, required assistance, or exhibited anxiety. No account of whether he seemed calm, agitated, tired, or distressed. The final interaction, verbal or otherwise, is not described. The night begins and ends without narrative texture. This absence functions as a gap in the evidentiary record. Investigators treat gaps differently depending on context. Some gaps occur because a witness truly cannot remember. Others occur because the detail was never encoded as significant. But when a gap appears around the most critical period of a case, the final hours, it demands closer examination. In forensic analysis, absence of detail is itself a form of data. This does not mean the absence proves concealment. It means the absence limits reconstruction. And when reconstruction is limited, investigators ask why. One explanation is emotional overload. Stress can impair recall. Another is that the night was uneventful and therefore unmemorable. But even uneventful nights are usually describable in routine terms. Caregivers may say, "Nothing unusual happened," but they often still describe the routine itself. Here, even the routine is missing. The lack of a described bedtime routine removes an important baseline. Without it, investigators cannot identify deviation. They cannot assess whether Sebastian's behavior that night aligned with his norm. They cannot determine whether any interaction might have precipitated distress or change. Similarly, the absence of a described final interaction leaves a void where verification would normally occur. In many cases, caregivers recall specific exchanges: a good night, a reminder, a complaint, a joke. These exchanges serve as temporal anchors. They establish presence and state. Without them, the timeline becomes abstract. This abstraction matters because the timeline in Sebastian's case is already fragile. The critical window, often cited as midnight to morning, is derived almost entirely from household statements. Without detailed anchors, that window remains approximate rather than precise. The omission extends to Sebastian's emotional state. Sebastian is often described in general terms: his interests, his sensitivities, his personality traits, but not in situ. There is no account of how he felt that night. Was he anxious, calm, withdrawn, engaged? None of these states are documented publicly. The absence is notable because emotional state can be a key indicator in disappearances, especially for vulnerable adolescents. Investigators look for signals: agitation, withdrawal, fixation, distress. These signals do not prove intent, but they contextualize risk. Without them, assessment becomes speculative. The night, in effect, has been flattened. This flattening contrasts sharply with the way other parts of the case are described. Certain elements, such as later recollections, general traits, or post-disappearance efforts, are articulated with more clarity. The imbalance suggests selective density. Some areas are elaborated, while the most critical remains vague. From an investigative standpoint, this selective density raises questions about prioritization rather than intent. Why are peripheral details clearer than central ones? Why does the narrative expand outward but not inward? Comparative behavior offers context. Sebastian's biological father, Seth, has been described as engaging in active search behaviors: traveling, distributing flyers, coordinating efforts. His actions are outward-facing and time-specific. He describes what he did, where he went, and what he sought. This action-based narrative contrasts with the static description of the final night. This contrast does not assign fault. It highlights differing orientations, one toward reconstruction, the other toward reflection. In investigations, reconstruction is essential. It requires revisiting uncomfortable moments, articulating mundane routines, and confronting uncertainty. Reflection, while human, does not advance timelines. When reflection replaces reconstruction, progress stalls. The absence of a detailed night description, therefore, carries investigative weight. It limits the ability to test hypotheses. It constrains verification. It leaves law enforcement with fewer tools to work backward from the moment of disappearance. There is also a temporal concern. As time passes, memories degrade. If details were not articulated early, they may be lost permanently. This is why investigators press for detail immediately, even when it is painful. Silence in the early phase has lasting consequences. Again, this analysis does not claim intent. It identifies effect. The night Sebastian disappeared remains undefined, not because it cannot be described in principle, but because it has not been described in practice. That distinction matters. In cases where physical evidence is absent, narratives carry disproportionate weight. When narratives omit the most critical period, the omission becomes a focal point. Investigators do not fill gaps with assumption. They mark them and return to them. The unresolved nature of that night continues to shape the investigation. Without a clear account, every hypothesis remains open. Without anchors, timelines drift. Without emotional context, risk assessment falters. This is why the night matters, not as a dramatic device, but as a missing data set. And it leads to a question that investigators cannot avoid, even if it remains unanswered. When a decisive night is left undescribed, What is being avoided or what has already been set aside? That question does not accuse. It defines the boundary of what remains unknown. The internal event hypothesis examines a narrow, but necessary possibility that the critical event leading to Sebastian Rogers' disappearance occurred inside the home, without outside intrusion, and without a documented departure. This hypothesis does not assert intent, culpability, or outcome. It addresses location and process, not responsibility. The hypothesis emerges not from suspicion, but from elimination. In missing person investigations, external explanations are typically assessed first. Investigators look for signs of forced entry, abduction, or voluntary departure. When any of those are supported by evidence, physical damage, surveillance footage, scent trails, or confirmed sightings, the case direction expands outward. When none are present, investigative logic contracts inward. In Sebastian's case, that contraction occurred early. There has been no sign of intrusion. Doors and windows showed no damage consistent with forced entry. There has been no evidence of exit. Canine searches did not establish a path away from the residence. Surveillance footage did not capture movement leaving the property. The environment surrounding the home did not yield physical confirmation that Sebastian departed on foot or by vehicle. These absences are not neutral. They shape the hypothesis space. When a disappearance leaves no outward trace, investigators must consider whether the decisive event occurred within a closed system, a limited space, with a known set of occupants. This is not a claim that something criminal occurred. It is a recognition that the environment itself did not register a transition from inside to outside. Within this framework, the internal event hypothesis proposes that whatever altered the course of events happened before any departure could be documented, or in a way that produced no detectable exit signal. The reported thud occupies a unique position within this hypothesis. Unlike other elements of the case, the thud is not an absence. It is a presence, an isolated auditory marker associated with the relevant time frame. It does not explain what happened. It does not identify cause, but it functions as the only described disturbance during the period in question. Investigatively, such a marker is treated as a temporal anchor, not a conclusion. Anchors are used to segment timelines. They help investigators ask targeted questions: what occurred before, during, and after the marker? Who was present? What conditions existed? What actions followed or did not follow? Importantly, the internal event hypothesis does not require the thud to be dramatic or intentional. It could represent a benign household occurrence. It could be unrelated. It could be misinterpreted. The hypothesis only notes that it is the sole described event during a window otherwise defined by silence. In a closed system analysis, even benign events matter because they can mark moments of change. The investigative value of this hypothesis lies in refocusing scope. Instead of searching beyond the home for explanations, it prioritizes space, access, and sequence within it. This includes examining who was present, what rooms were accessible, what movements were possible without triggering sensors or cameras, and how routine activities could produce or mask sound. This focus does not presume wrongdoing. It presumes proximity. Closed system hypotheses are common in investigations precisely because they are efficient. They reduce variables. They allow investigators to test scenarios against physical constraints, floor plans, sight lines, noise transmission, timing, and habit. They also allow for verification through reenactment and forensic review if evidence exists. At present, no such physical evidence has been publicly disclosed. This limitation is critical. The internal event hypothesis remains unconfirmed because it depends on physical corroboration that has not been released or may not exist. Without forensic indicators such as disturbed items, biological traces, or device data, no internal scenario can be elevated beyond possibility. That limitation also forms the strongest rebuttal to the hypothesis. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is also not evidence of occurrence. A closed system event would typically leave some trace, even if subtle. The lack of publicly known forensic findings tempers the hypothesis and prevents escalation to assertion. Investigators must therefore treat this hypothesis as conditional. It is considered when other explanations fail, but it cannot replace them without support. It exists alongside alternative possibilities. including undetected departure or unknown external involvement. Its purpose is to ensure that the investigative lens does not ignore the most immediate environment when broader searches produce nothing. Another critical component of this hypothesis is personnel presence. In closed system analysis, investigators catalog who had access to the space during the relevant window. This is not about suspicion. It is about opportunity to observe, intervene, or notice. Presence determines who could corroborate events, not who caused them. This is why the hypothesis directs attention to human factors: sleep patterns, awareness, routine, and response rather than motives. The question is not who did something, but who could have known something. The internal event hypothesis also intersects with risk assessment for vulnerable individuals. Adolescents with autism may respond unpredictably to environmental stimuli. They may move quietly. They may remain in confined spaces. They may not seek help audibly. These characteristics complicate detection and underscore why internal environments must be scrutinized carefully. However, this same complexity demands caution. Vulnerability increases the need for evidence, not speculation. Any internal scenario must be tested against objective constraints, not inferred from general traits. From an investigative standpoint, the next steps implied by this hypothesis are procedural, not accusatory. They include detailed mapping of the home's interior, acoustic assessment of noise transmission, review of any available device data, reconstruction of movement possibilities during nighttime hours, and re-interviewing occupants with focus on sequence rather than interpretation. These steps seek clarity, not confirmation. The hypothesis also recognizes a broader investigative truth. When a case reaches the point where hypotheses focus on internal events, it signals that the investigation has entered its most difficult phase. External leads have narrowed. Progress depends on precision rather than expansion. This is where discipline matters. Labeling the internal event hypothesis as a scenario hypothesis, unconfirmed, is essential. It prevents narrative drift. It protects against premature conclusions. It keeps the analysis tethered to method rather than emotion. The hypothesis does not compete with others. It complements them by ensuring that the absence of outward evidence is not ignored. Ultimately, the internal event hypothesis asks investigators to confront a simple but uncomfortable possibility that the key to understanding Sebastian Rogers' disappearance may lie not in what happened after he left the house, but in what occurred before anyone realized he was gone. That possibility remains unproven, and until physical evidence is disclosed or discovered, it must remain exactly where it belongs: examined, constrained, and unresolved. When physical evidence is limited, investigators turn to behavior not to interpret character, but to assess priority, urgency, and belief. In missing person cases, especially those involving children, behavioral comparison between caregivers can provide critical context, not because one response is correct and the other wrong, but because differences in action often reflect differences in internal assumptions. In the case of Sebastian Rogers, the contrast between the behavior of his mother, Katie Proudfoot, and his biological father, Seth Rogers, is pronounced. This contrast does not establish guilt or innocence. It establishes asymmetry. Seth Rogers' response to Sebastian's disappearance has been consistently described as action-oriented. He has participated in searches, distributed flyers, and traveled extensively to raise awareness. His efforts appear directed toward locating Sebastian in the present physically, geographically, and immediately. These actions are concrete. They involve movement, repetition, and exposure. They are difficult to sustain over time and often come at personal cost. Katie Proudfoot's public-facing behavior follows a different pattern. Her presence has been more closely associated with interviews, reflective commentary, and discussions oriented toward memory, meaning, and future projects. Rather than emphasizing ongoing search logistics, her statements often revisit Sebastian's personality, past experiences, and symbolic legacy. These are not inherently incompatible responses. Parents grieve and cope differently. However, in investigative analysis, difference itself is informative. Investigators do not ask which parent is more emotional or more composed. They ask what each parent's behavior suggests about their internal model of the situation. Actions are evaluated as indicators of belief. The core assumption in a missing child case is that the child may still be alive. When that assumption is held strongly, behavior tends to reflect urgency. Parents act as if time matters. They pursue exposure aggressively. They amplify visibility. They operate under the premise that every hour counts. Seth's behavior aligns with that model. Traveling to distribute flyers is not symbolic. It is tactical. It is designed to increase the probability that someone, somewhere, will recognize Sebastian and report a sighting. Participating in searches is not reflective. It is operational. It is an attempt to reduce uncertainty through physical action. These behaviors suggest an internal belief that Sebastian can still be found. Katie's behavior suggests a different orientation, not necessarily a different belief, but a different prioritization. Her public efforts appear less focused on expanding the search footprint and more focused on narrative framing. Interviews allow for control over messaging. Reflection allows for meaning-making. Future-oriented projects imply continuity beyond the immediate crisis. From an investigative standpoint, this divergence matters. It creates an effort asymmetry, a measurable difference in how each parent allocates energy in response to the same event. Effort asymmetry does not indicate wrongdoing. It indicates differing interpretations of what is most necessary. Investigators note such asymmetries because they can reflect underlying assumptions. A parent who believes a child is still recoverable often behaves differently from one who believes the outcome is fixed, even subconsciously. This belief may not be articulated. It may not even be fully conscious, but it often manifests in action. Urgency is not expressed through words alone. It is expressed through motion. Katie's emphasis on interviews and reflective commentary introduces another investigative consideration: narrative control. Interviews, particularly with sympathetic platforms, allow a speaker to shape perception. They prioritize explanation over exploration. This is not inherently deceptive. Many people seek to clarify their position in the face of public scrutiny. However, narrative control serves a different function than search expansion. One manages interpretation, the other seeks discovery. In cases where a child remains missing, investigators expect these functions to coexist. Parents often both search and speak. The balance between the two becomes relevant. When one function appears to dominate, investigators ask why. The divergence between Katie and Seth is therefore not about who is doing more. It is about what each appears to be doing for. Seth's actions are directed outward toward the public, toward geography, toward the unknown. Katie's actions are directed inward toward explanation, toward memory, toward future framing. These directions imply different relationships to uncertainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. Some respond by trying to eliminate it through action. Others respond by managing it through meaning. Neither response is pathological. But in investigations, responses that reduce uncertainty through physical means are often prioritized because they preserve recoverability. This difference also affects how investigators assess cooperation. Cooperation is not measured solely by compliance with questioning. It is measured by alignment with investigative goals. When one parent's actions consistently align with locating the missing person, and the others do not, investigators take note. Again, this does not assign motive. It informs strategy. Another important factor is time orientation. Seth's behavior is present-oriented. His actions assume Sebastian exists somewhere now. Katie's behavior often appears past-oriented or future-oriented, recounting who Sebastian was, or discussing what may come later. This temporal framing mirrors the linguistic patterns noted elsewhere in the case. Behavior and language often reinforce each other. When language frames a subject as past, behavior may unconsciously follow. When behavior shifts away from immediate recovery, language may soften urgency. These feedback loops are not evidence of wrongdoing. They are evidence of cognitive framing. Investigators are trained to observe these loops, particularly when they diverge between individuals who share the same stated goal. The key investigative value of this comparison lies in consistency. Seth's actions, language, and focus appear aligned around one premise. Sebastian is missing and must be found. Katie's actions and language appear aligned around a more complex premise, one that includes remembrance, interpretation, and continuity beyond the search. Neither premise can be disproven by behavior alone, but they cannot both reflect the same internal assumption about Sebastian's status. This is why the contrast matters. If both parents believe Sebastian is alive and recoverable, investigators would expect at least some convergence in urgency and method. Divergence suggests differing beliefs, priorities, or coping mechanisms. Each possibility has investigative implications. Belief shapes behavior. Behavior shapes investigative direction. The comparison between Katie and Seth does not resolve the case. It clarifies why the case feels unbalanced. One parent behaves as if time is running out. The other behaves as if time has already been recontextualized. In the absence of physical evidence, such contrasts become part of the analytical landscape. They do not prove what happened. They help explain how the investigation has unfolded and why attention has concentrated where it has. The comparison leaves investigators with a question that is not accusatory, but foundational. If both parents believe Sebastian is alive, why does only one behave as if he can still be found? That question does not end the analysis. It explains why it continues. In investigations where physical evidence is limited, information flow becomes a form of terrain. Who speaks, where they speak, and under what conditions can shape both public perception and investigative pressure. This is not inherently deceptive. It is strategic, and in the case of Sebastian Rogers, strategy itself becomes a data point. The central focus of this section is not what Katie Proudfoot has said, but where and how she has chosen to say it. Following Sebastian's disappearance, Katie's public appearances have been selective. She has engaged primarily with small, friendly YouTube channels platforms characterized by sympathetic hosts, limited reach, and low adversarial pressure. These appearances tend to emphasize reflection, memory, and personal narrative. They are structured conversations rather than confrontational interviews. Questions are predictable. Tone is controlled. Notably absent are appearances on larger platforms with investigative focus, cross-examination formats, or independent journalists known for challenging inconsistencies. There is also a lack of participation in broader, high-visibility public search efforts that typically accompany missing child cases. This pattern is observable, not speculative. In missing child investigations, parents commonly pursue maximum exposure. They appear on as many platforms as possible. They accept uncomfortable interviews. They repeat the same information publicly, often at great personal cost, because amplification increases the chance, however small, of recognition, tips, or sightings. Exposure is treated as a resource to be exploited, not managed. Katie's approach diverges from this norm. Rather than amplifying reach, her media engagement appears designed to contain it. The selection of platforms limits audience size and moderates questioning. The tone remains sympathetic. The narrative remains stable. Risk is minimized. From an investigative standpoint, this divergence raises questions not about guilt, but about priority. Why choose environments that reduce exposure when exposure is typically the objective? One benign explanation is emotional self-protection. Adversarial interviews can be psychologically damaging. Caregivers may avoid them to preserve mental health. Another explanation is fear of online harassment, which is common in high-profile cases. Limiting exposure may be an attempt to reduce harm. These explanations are plausible and must be acknowledged. However, investigators also consider the functional consequences of selective engagement. Limiting exposure also limits scrutiny. It reduces the likelihood of spontaneous, uncontrolled questioning. It prevents new audiences from examining the timeline. It constrains the range of interpretations. This is where narrative containment becomes relevant. Narrative containment does not require deception. It requires curation. By choosing specific platforms, a speaker can maintain consistency, avoid contradictions, and control pacing. This can be beneficial for messaging. It can also slow investigative momentum. Investigators are trained to observe when a subject appears more invested in how the story is told than in how widely it is heard. This distinction matters in missing person cases because the primary goal, finding the missing individual, typically overrides reputational concerns. Katie's approach appears to prioritize tone management over amplification. Her appearances emphasize clarity, composure, and reflection. They do not emphasize calls to action, geographic expansion of searches, or repeated urgent appeals to the public. This is not an accusation. It is a contrast. Another element of control is topic selection. In her appearances, certain areas are discussed extensively: Sebastian's personality, interests, and past experiences. Other areas receive minimal attention: detailed reconstruction of the night, specific search logistics, or unresolved inconsistencies. This selective density mirrors patterns observed elsewhere in the case. Control of the story is also reflected in what is declined. There is limited evidence of Katie participating in large-scale public search coordination, or in efforts that would place her alongside law enforcement in highly visible operational roles. Such participation often invites unscripted interaction and spontaneous questioning. Avoiding it reduces unpredictability. From an investigative perspective, unpredictability is not a threat. It is an opportunity. Unplanned questions can reveal gaps, prompt clarification, or surface new leads. When unpredictability is systematically avoided, investigators ask why. Again, this does not imply wrongdoing. It implies risk aversion. Risk aversion can be rational. It can also conflict with investigative goals. When a parent's strategy minimizes exposure, investigators must assess whether that strategy aligns with the objective of finding the missing child. This assessment becomes more salient when combined with other patterns: linguistic framing that suggests closure, behavioral emphasis on reflection rather than action, and absence of detailed reconstruction of critical events. Each element alone is ambiguous. Together, they form a coherent strategy of containment. The investigative value of this observation lies in understanding how information moves, or does not move, through the public domain. Cases are not solved by narratives alone, but narratives influence tips, witnesses, and public engagement. When a narrative is tightly controlled, fewer external variables enter the system. This can slow the discovery of contradictions or alternative hypotheses. Investigators therefore consider whether narrative containment is intentional or incidental. Is it a byproduct of stress and caution? Or is it a deliberate attempt to limit exposure to scrutiny? The answer cannot be assumed. It must be tested. This testing occurs through comparison. Other parents in similar circumstances often accept exposure, even when it is uncomfortable. They do so because the potential benefit: new information outweighs personal risk. When a parent chooses otherwise, investigators note the divergence. The question is not whether Katie should speak more. It is why the balance consistently favors control over reach. In investigations, control and cooperation are not opposites, but they can be in tension. Cooperation seeks to expand the pool of information. Control seeks to manage it. When control dominates, investigators may need to seek information through other channels. This dynamic helps explain why investigative focus intensifies even in the absence of physical evidence. When information is tightly managed, investigators compensate by scrutinizing what is available more closely. The strategy of narrative containment does not prove intent. It reveals priorities. And priorities matter when time is critical. Which leads to the unresolved question that frames this section. Why manage optics instead of amplification, when amplification is how missing children are usually found? That question does not accuse. It explains why the story itself has become part of the investigation. At this point in the analysis, one conclusion must be stated clearly and without ambiguity: no accusation has been made, and no verdict has been reached. The disappearance of Sebastian Rogers remains unresolved. There is no publicly confirmed physical evidence establishing what happened to him. There is no official determination of criminal responsibility. Any claim beyond that would exceed the available facts and undermine the integrity of the investigation itself. What this case offers instead is something more difficult and more instructive. It offers a lesson in how investigations evolve when evidence is absent, when silence replaces traces, and when narrative becomes the primary material left to examine. Throughout this analysis, several hypotheses have been presented. Each remains open. None has been proven. Together, they form a framework for understanding why the Sebastian Rogers case shifted the way it did, and why attention has narrowed where it has. The caregiver exclusive access hypothesis remains unresolved. If Sebastian did not leave the home and no outside involvement is evidenced, The focus on the last caregiver is not optional, it is procedural. That focus does not assign guilt. It assigns responsibility for clarity. The behavioral incongruity hypothesis remains unresolved. The reported thud, the lack of response, and the mismatch between stated risk factors and real-time behavior raise questions that have not been answered. Whether the sound represents an actual event, a reconstructed memory, or a narrative anchor remains unknown. The linguistic leakage hypothesis remains unresolved. Patterned use of past tense and memorial framing may reflect fatigue, stress, or coping, but repetition suggests premature psychological closure that merits examination. Language does not prove events. It reveals belief. The narrative control hypothesis remains unresolved. Selective media engagement and limited exposure may be self-protection or strategic containment. Either way, it alters the investigative environment. None of these hypotheses accuses. All of them point to uncertainty, and uncertainty is the central reality of this case. What investigators face here is not a puzzle with missing pieces. It is a puzzle made almost entirely of negative space. No scent, no camera, no confirmed movement, no physical exit. When evidence fails to appear, investigators are forced to examine what remains: words, behavior, timing, and omission. That is not a failure of investigation. It is its final stage. This case teaches several critical investigative lessons. First, language is data, not in isolation, and not as proof but as signal. Patterns of speech, tense selection, and framing reveal how individuals internally process events. When language shifts faster than evidence, investigators take notice, not to accuse, but to understand cognition and priority. Second, silence is also information. The absence of detail, particularly about the final night, is not neutral. It limits reconstruction. It narrows verification. In investigations, silence is marked, not ignored. Gaps are not filled with assumptions, they are revisited. Third, behavioral deviation must be examined, not avoided. When actions diverge from expected patterns, whether in response to risk, urgency, or exposure, those divergences are not dismissed as personality differences alone. They are assessed in context. Avoidance of uncomfortable analysis does not protect innocence, it weakens inquiry. Importantly, these lessons apply beyond this case. They are principles used in missing person investigations worldwide, particularly when physical evidence fails. The question then becomes, where does this case go next? If progress is to be made, the direction is not outward. It is inward. First, the timeline attributed to Katie Proudfoot must be re-examined with rigor, not as accusation, but as reconstruction. Statements should be compared across time. Language shifts should be mapped. Inconsistencies, if any, should be contextualized, not sensationalized. Second, the night of Sebastian's disappearance must be analyzed again, not for drama, but for detail. What was not described needs to be requested. What was glossed over needs to be clarified. Even mundane routines matter when they are the last known moments. Third, statements must be examined longitudinally, not just what was said, but how it changed. Investigators often uncover insight not in contradiction, but in evolution. What becomes emphasized, what recedes, and what disappears entirely. None of these steps presume guilt. All of them presume responsibility to the truth. This is also where public engagement plays a role. Carefully, viewers and observers should resist the urge to conclude. The most damaging thing in unresolved cases is premature certainty. What the public can contribute instead is attention to detail, patience, and restraint. Which detail caused you to pause? Was it the language, the absence of description, the behavioral contrast between parents, the speed of the investigative shift? Which hypothesis feels most plausible to you and why? And perhaps most importantly, what question has not been answered that law enforcement should address next? Those questions matter more than speculation. Because Sebastian Rogers is not a theory. He is a missing child. And cases like this are rarely solved by searching harder. They are solved by listening more carefully, by re-examining what has been said, what has not, and what may have been assumed too quickly. This investigation may not advance by covering more ground. Sebastian may not be found by searching the ground. He may be found by examining the story told by the last person who spoke for him. That is not a conclusion. It is the responsibility left behind by absence.